The Nobel Prize in Economics is an annual prize awarded to economists who have made significant contributions to the social sciences. The reason why the Nobel Prize in Economics technically has a different name is because it was not one of the original prizes established by Alfred Nobel when he set up the foundation to clean up his public image as a bomb maker. Economics does genuinely have the capacity to massively improve the lives of billions of people in the same way that the other sciences and disciplines do, if they're implemented correctly.
There's a famous saying attributed to Mark Twain that it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Now apparently Twain did not in fact say this, but for this video I'm going to behave just like an economist and assume that he did say that, because it's certainly true about economists. In fact, there are so many things that economists know for sure that just ain't so, that economics shouldn't have a Nobel Prize award, which is false anyway. It should have a Mark Twain award for confident falsehoods. It would be awarded for statements that are provably false, but which are confidently asserted to be true by economists. The capacity for economists to believe falsehoods wouldn't be a problem if they were the only ones who were deluded by those falsehoods. But because we trust economists as being experts on the economy, they end up deluding public policymakers because, to channel Donald Rumsford, the public and policymakers and the media don't know that economists don't know. We've taken the advice of economists on things on which they claim to be experts. We've followed that advice, and that has led into economic catastrophes. We see problems where they don't exist, and we damage the economy by trying to fix these non-problems. We ignore real problems, which end up derailing the economy, as happened back in 2007, 2008. The clearest recent example of economists misleading policymakers is the global financial crisis. This was caused by the growth and collapse of a private debt bubble, but they ignore private debt on the assumption that lending is what they call a pure redistribution, which transfers money from savers to borrowers, and banks operate as intermediaries. If that were true, you could ignore private debt, because increases or decreases in the level of private debt would not have any significant macroeconomic effects. And that's how Bernanke put it in his book Essays on the Great Depression, which was effectively his application for the job of Federal Reserve Chairman. He said, absent implausibly large differences in marginal spending propensities among the groups, savers and borrowers, it was suggested that pure redistributions should have no significant macroeconomic effects. Even a casual look at the data shows this can't possibly be true. The level of private debt has risen from 50% of GDP to 170% over the post-war period. The correlation between change in the level of private debt and unemployment has always been significant. The correlation for the 70 years between 1955 and 2025 is minus 0.34. When credit goes up, unemployment goes down, and vice versa. The correlation rises as the level of private debt rises. Between 1990 and 2015, when private debt exceeded 120% of GDP, it reached a staggering minus 0.93. Now, this superficially positive role for credit sets us up for disaster over time. A rising ratio of private debt to GDP leads to a rising debt service burden for the private sector, and at some point they take on more credit, as they did during the subprime bubble, to paying the debt level down. In the global financial crisis, credit fell from plus 15% of GDP in 2007 to minus 5% in 2009, and unemployment doubled as a result. So if a theory implies that the correlation between credit and unemployment should be close to zero, and it actually turns out to be much closer to -1, this fact alone shows the theory must be wrong. Obviously, credit has significant economic effects. But Bernanke wasn't even aware of this data because his prior belief tells him there's no point even checking it. I'm certain he's never even looked at this freely available debt. The debt data I'm showing in these charts come from the Bank of International Settlements, the unemployment data from the OECD. Bernanke's confidently held false belief led him to make possibly the biggest gaffe in the history of economics, when, as Federal Reserve Chairman, he told Congress on July 18, 2007 that, and I quote, economic activity appears poised to expand at a moderate rate in the second half of 2007, and it should gradually strengthen into 2008. Now, just 3 weeks after his report to Congress, the global financial crisis began. The rate of economic growth at the end of 2008 was minus 2.5%, versus Bernanke's declaration to Congress just 18 months earlier that it would be plus 2.75. Bernanke made this mistake because he believes the textbook model of loanable funds, in which banks don't actually make loans. Instead, according to the textbook, banks are intermediaries that enable savers to lend to borrowers. He therefore ignored the data on private debt, which his own organisation collected. Now, you might have expected him to revise his beliefs after this incredible error. And also, between the global financial crisis and when he was given the Nobel Prize award, several central banks published papers rejecting the model of banks as intermediaries, most notably the Bank of England in 2014 and the Bundesbank in 2017. But Bernanke didn't change his views at all. His Nobel Prize lecture treated banks as intermediaries between what he called the ultimate savers and the ultimate borrowers. And none of the contrary central bank papers turned up in his lecture. I doubt that he's even read them. Now, given this stellar performance, Bernanke deserves to be the first recipient of the Mark Twain Award for confident falsehoods. Why didn't he learn from experience? Why did he ignore contrary analysis by the central banks? Why did he ignore the data? It's because he lives in a bubble in which everyone he interacts with is either another neoclassical economist who also believes that banks are mere intermediaries and have to borrow from someone else before they can lend, or they're politicians that have been persuaded by him in the first place. That's the truth. But it isn't just Bernanke who is wrong. It's the entirety of mainstream neoclassical economics and also the relatives in the so-called Austrian school of economics. Now, to know why they're wrong, you have to understand something the vast majority of economists are clueless. That's accounting. I know that accounting sounds about as exciting as watching grass grow, and I know many accountants who feel that way about their jobs, but it's vitally important because mistakes about accounting are quite literally responsible for almost all the economic woes we face today. The global financial crisis, the stagnant Western economies today, crumbling infrastructure, rising inequality, overpriced housing, they're all due to economists being clueless about accounting. Unfortunately, politicians, journalists, and most of the public trust the advice of economists about money because, hey, they're economists. Aren't they supposed to be the experts on money? Well, no, they're not. Instead, what they know for sure that just ain't so is not just banking itself, but also money, private debt, and government debt. And this is obvious when you put their beliefs into the form that accountants use to track financial transactions. That's double-entry bookkeeping. It's a simple but profound way to keep accurate track of money. Its basic rules are the following. First of all, you classify all the claims that you have on other entities as your assets. You classify all the claims that other entities have on you as your liabilities, and you record the difference between your assets and your liabilities as your equity. You make 2 entries for every transaction, one showing its impact on you, the other showing the impact on the other party to a transaction, and you make sure that there is a credit, CR, and a debit, DR, entry in every transaction. This last operation is what makes accounting so difficult. You have to know what to classify as a CR and a DR entry, depending on whether you're making that entry on assets or liabilities or equity columns in a ledger. I've worked out a much simpler way to do this, which is built into my Ravel software. Just use plus and minus signs. Plus if a transaction increases an account, minus if it reduces an account, and make sure that for the whole transaction, the equation assets minus liabilities minus equity equals 0. When you apply this to pronouncements by economists on monetary matters, you can show economists confidently don't know what they're talking about. Now, a recent example of confidence falsehoods turned up on Twitter in response to a post by Richard Murphy about how economics is inherently political. The discussion drifted onto the topic of whether the government creates money when it spends. And a tweeter with the name The Leg, who describes himself as an Austrian economist and who works for a family office, confidently stated that the government doesn't create money when it spends because it first has to borrow from the bond market. Now, another tweet from George Selgin disputed a claim that I made that banks can't lend from reserves, which is part of the model of the money multiplier. When you apply the rules of double-entry bookkeeping to these very confident statements by the Leg and by Selgin, you can see that they violate the rules of accounting. What they know for sure just ain't so. I'll start with the Leg's assertion that government borrowing from bond markets is just like spending using his credit card. Now, let's say that whatever the Leg was buying from a shop with his credit card was worth $100. Then the transaction looks like this. The leg gets $100 of extra debt on his credit card. The shop he is borrowing from gets $100 of extra money. Notice that this transaction affects both the asset side of the bank, the amount that leg owes on his credit card, and the bank's liabilities, the amount of money in the shop's deposit account. The leg claims that what the government does when it borrows from the bond market is the same operation. Well, it's easy to show that this is false, that the two operations are not equivalent using double entry bookkeeping. What the leg is calling government borrowing is actually the Treasury selling bonds directly to the private banks in what are known as primary auctions in the United States and gilt auctions in the UK and similar names elsewhere in the world. To take part in these auctions, you have to have an account at the central bank, where those accounts are called reserves by economists. The successful bidders transfer funds from their reserve accounts to the treasurer's account. This is what those auction transfers look like at the central bank. Bonds don't turn up on that table because bonds are neither assets nor liabilities for the central bank. Instead, they're a liability for the Treasury and an asset for the private banks. So when banks buy bonds from the Treasury and primary auctions, their reserves fall while their bonds rise. And this is shown in this table, that the action in the auction is entirely on the asset side of the banking system's ledger. So at this point, it's obvious that the legs claim that government borrowing from the bank is the same as him borrowing from a shop is at best not strictly true. The private operation straddles the assets and the liabilities of the banking sector. The leg's debt to the bank increases, and so does the deposit account of the shop. But when the government sells bonds, on the other hand, everything happens solely on the asset side of the banking sector's ledger. The ledger's unaware of this because, like all neoclassical and Austrian economists, he thinks he understands accounting, but he doesn't. Selgin's confident statement that if banks can use reserves to buy securities, they can use them to finance loans, is an even worse error, because he's correct that banks buy securities using reserves. Reserves go down, bonds held by the banks go up, and the fundamental equation of accounting, that assets minus liabilities minus equity equals zero, is obeyed by that operation. But if you apply the same operation to making a loan, reserves go down and bank deposits go up, and that violates that equation. This is because reserves are an asset while deposits are a liability. A minus on the former and a plus in the latter does not sum to zero. This can't be how banks lend. Now, what if we show lending reducing reserves and increasing loans at the same time? Well, then the accounting works. But how does the borrower get the money? The bank's assets and reserves fall and the loans rise, which obeys the accounting equation. But all the borrower gets out of this so far is a liability with no asset. The only way that the borrower can get an asset equivalent to the liability they've taken on with borrowing from the banks is if the bank makes a loan in cash. Then the increase in debt, which is the borrower's liability, is precisely offset by an increase in cash, the borrower's asset. Now, that might have been the norm in the 19th century, but today it's obsolete. In today's electronic banking world, when you take out a loan, the bank increases your deposit account by the same amount that it increases the debt that you owe them. There's no need to use reserves to make a loan. The actual process of lending doesn't involve reserves at all, and it's extremely simple, much, much simpler than the textbook model. The bank increases your debt and increases your asset at the same time. So why do economists resist this simple, realistic model of how banks lend? It's because this means that bank lending has significant macroeconomic effects, and therefore you have to include the banking sector when you build macroeconomic models. Now, this is anathema to neoclassical economists because for their entire history, they've always believed that money doesn't matter in macroeconomics. This is why they build models of the macroeconomy which do not include banks or private debt or money. And to admit that banks create money when they lend and that this newly created money has significant macroeconomic effects undermines their entire approach to economics. It undermines their a priori belief that capitalism is fundamentally a barter system and that you can ignore the financial sector when you do macroeconomics. So they stick with their loanable funds model of banking, despite the fact that it led them to be unaware of the approach of the global financial crisis. We suffered the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression because economists are more interested in preserving their paradigm from attack than they are in helping us avoid economic crises. Now, in a subsequent video, I'll show why the model of loanable funds led to economists ignoring the rapid increase in private debt that led to the global financial crisis. In the meantime, treat everything you hear from a mainstream economist as a case of the Mark Twain syndrome, the confident belief in something that just ain't so.
Like many other truth seekers, I want to learn 50 years of real economics from me in only 7 weeks. You'll love my new 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge as well. To apply, go to stevekeen.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and make friends with a great group of like-minded people. So again, like many others, go to stevekeen.com to apply as well for the 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge. Good luck.